Welcome to the second of this series, Sadler's Honest Book Reviews, in which I look at literature having to do with philosophy, particularly practical philosophy, leadership, communication, all sorts of things that pertain to how we live our lives. Today, I'm very happy to be reviewing this book, Massimo Pigliucci's How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. Now, I do have to give you a bit of a warning ahead of time. Massimo is somebody who I know quite well and actually work with, so he's a colleague and friend. So it doesn't mean I'm going to be taking it easy on him, but I always want to give people fair warning ahead of time. This is a copy that was sent to me by the publisher, Basic Books, for me to review some time back. And what I'll say about this right off the bat, for those who want the thumbnail sketch, is it's a great introduction to Stoic thought. It focuses particularly on Epictetus, but ranges over a lot of other material. I think it's a faithful transmission of Stoic ideas written for the common person. So this really makes a major contribution to the popular literature on Stoicism that we find getting put out today. So my recommendation is to get it. There are a few little points that I'll talk about in the very end where I find myself not completely in disagreement, but at least not on exactly the same page. But on the whole, it's a really good book, and I would suggest it for anybody who has an interest in learning more about Stoicism. All right, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty now. Let's talk about the style of the work, the structure of the work, and then sort of a summary of some of the key ideas that are being worked on throughout this book. So it's got a very interesting style. A good portion of it is sort of the typical present things for a modern, non-philosophical audience, and I think Massimo does that quite well. But one of the striking bits about this is that much of it is actually framed as sort of an ongoing dialogue or conversation with one of the greatest of the Stoic philosophers, Epictetus. And so Massimo is drawing on passages from the Enchiridion and from Epictetus's much longer discourses, which most of the Enchiridion is drawn from. We think that some of the Enchiridion may be drawn from some of the lost books of the discourses, but we still have a good portion. And what Massimo's doing is sort of blending those into his own text so that Epictetus is providing responses to kind of the common questions or concerns that are going to come up from a contemporary audience. So I actually think that's a very successful strategy. He brings in a number of other thinkers as well, many of whom are Stoic philosophers, and then some of whom are other ancient philosophers, but not Stoics, and a number of contemporary thinkers, contemporary going back, say, through the last 2 centuries as well. So the book is actually, as far as its structure, broken down into 14 chapters. There's, of course, beginning with kind of an introduction, and Massimo sets this up along a very popular way of presenting Stoic philosophy that is also taken from Epictetus. So I think it does make sense to use it here. And that is to distinguish these 3 disciplines: the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and then the discipline of assent. And so there are 4 chapters given to each of those. There's 2 chapters at the beginning, and then what we find is a nice little summary of Hellenistic schools of practical philosophy at the very end. There are plenty of notes where you're going to find out where these things are coming from. It's very well documented. There's a pretty good index. So for the reader who wants those sorts of features, I think that this is going to be a very useful text. So let's talk now about what you're going to find in this work. Massimo starts out in chapter 1 by talking about how he himself ended up arriving at Stoicism. And I think this may be familiar to some readers already if they've looked at his blog or if they know his works. But it's a great narrative nonetheless. And I think that can be quite interesting for many people. He's talking about his own development. So it's like a little tiny mini memoir of intellectual life, and also situating that in relation to some of the other big movements of the contemporary age, or those that have survived into it. He mentions, for example, how he situates himself in relation to the new atheism. And then the second chapter is a roadmap for the journey, where he gives us sort of an overview of Stoic thought in general, how we might view it, where the Stoics have been, successful, where they haven't, you might say. And then he launches into these three main sections, like I said, each of which consists of 4 chapters. So in the discipline of desire, it's subtitled, What It Is Proper to Want or Not to Want. This is something that the Stoics paid a lot of attention to, and Massimo zeroes in on 4 main things in his chapters. He starts out by talking about Epictetus's famous distinction between what is in our power, what is up to us, and what is not. This is something that a lot of people take as sort of the one-liner for what constitutes Stoicism in general. And it does come to us primarily from Epictetus, although we can see discussions of that as well in other earlier Stoic philosophers, just not as fully developed. And he goes through it and addresses a number of the issues that typically arise. He's got some great examples in here. Chapter 4, he's looking at this conception that the Stoics had that's also a one-liner, Stoicism as living in accordance with nature. Well, that raises a lot of questions for the contemporary reader, particularly since we often have very different conceptions of what counts as nature, physis in Greek, natura in Latin, than did the ancient Stoics. And again, Massimo, I think, does a great job in running through some of these contemporary understandings, explaining how the Stoics had something different in mind, where the Stoic point of view might be in need of some reinterpretation. Massimo's reinterpretation is largely to live in accordance with nature means to live in accordance with reason, or to live rationally. And here he's really at his strength. I mean, this is something that Massimo has been writing about in many other works for quite a long time and engaging in debates about. Then he brings up this issue of, the chapter title is Playing Ball with Socrates, and he talks about the notion of indifference, which is a great conception that the Stoics didn't completely originate, but certainly made the most out of, and I think it winds up being kind of a tripping point for many people who are studying Stoicism in the present. Now, it's interesting, there's a little bit of a side note, that even back in the Stoics' own time, they're like, listen, I understand this is technological, or this is technical language, here's what we actually mean by it, because there were continually misunderstandings arising about that. And so, he's got some great examples in here. And then, interestingly enough, bringing out the sort of theological dimensions, he talks in this chapter, God or Atoms, about where he differs from Epictetus and from the Stoics. Massimo is kind of a famous atheist, skeptic. He made his bones, I think, in many respects, writing and speaking about this sort of stuff. So it would be strange for him to be having a religious conversion in terms of Stoicism. And so he's talking about how modern Stoicism might differ from that of Epictetus, who is probably one of the most religiously oriented Stoics, and the other Stoic philosophers. How, what are the prospects for a current Stoic in terms of religious belief? And so that's a very useful discussion, I think. Then once he starts moving to the discipline of action, thinking about no longer just how we desire and are averse to things, but also, what we do. This is sometimes called the discipline of choice, as well as the discipline of action. He focuses on the first place about character and the virtues, and this is another key Stoic idea, that the goal of life is to live in accordance with virtue. The Stoics did famously hold that only virtue is the good and only vice is the bad in the fullest sense for human beings. So Massimo does a great job in developing this. There's a really interesting discussion where he's bringing in sort of cross-cultural discussion, not only of the four cardinal virtues, but also of several others, humanity and transcendence, and he shows how Stoicism, properly understood, can fit in with that. Then he's got this really interesting discussion, a very crucial word, where he starts out talking about the Medea, and he's going to eventually discuss what's called a mathia. And there's different ways of translating this, and I think Massimo does a good job. It's not merely ignorance, it's kind of a thoughtlessness, it's a not thinking things through entirely. And this addresses the question about, how is it that people can, in fact, do things that they seem to think are bad? If they know they're bad, why are they doing them? And so Massimo's got a very nice discussion of that in here. Something that I should mention, he also made the core of his presentation at the most recent Stoicon. Chapter 9 looks at role models and how it is that the Stoics themselves provided and looked to role models, and how we might do that as well. Here he talks about Admiral Stockdale and his use of Epictetus in the prison camps in North Vietnam during the Vietnamese War. And then finally, a really important chapter, I think, chapter 10, Disability and Mental Illness. The question that's being raised is, is Stoicism applicable to the range of things that fall into the category these days of mental illness, or is it really a therapy that as we might say about philosophical counseling, quite famously Lou Marinoff coins this, a therapy for the sane? And Massimo's answer is, as it should be, yes and no. Not everything that we call mental illness today is necessarily amenable to applying Stoic philosophy, but a good bit of it is, and so there's a nice interface between there. And he brings up Lawrence Becker's, if you don't know Lawrence Becker's work, A New Stoicism, his discussion of his own adversities that he faced and how Stoicism helped him with that. So I think that's actually a very nice, nuanced treatment. Then we move on to the discipline of assent, how we react to things. Massimo has a chapter here on death and suicide. The Stoics were quite famous for having committed suicide in certain circumstances. I should mention here that, it's very clear from the Stoic point of view that suicide is not really a good option for most people. It's only in very unique circumstances, not unique, but certain circumstances, restricted circumstances, and when the person himself or herself is really doing it because of their character, not just as an escape. But death is also an interesting thing to bring up. The Stoics were famously materialists, so how do they actually view death as not itself being an evil? Then there's a great chapter here, chapter 12, how to deal with anger, anxiety, and loneliness, probably three of the most important and yet also devastating affects that we feel in modern life. They were also pretty important in ancient life as well, and the Stoics have a lot to say about that. Then what might be a bit of a surprise to many people, chapter 13, love and friendship. Massimo begins with one of my favorite passages where Epictetus has this guy who just abandoned his daughter when she was sick, coming to him, saying that he did so out of familial affection, and Epictetus says, I'm not quite sure about that. Let's consider this. So there's some great discussion in here about how we feel affection, how we love, whether that has a role in Stoicism. And the answer, of course, is yes, indeed it does. And then finally, we finish up with a chapter that I guess does belong in the discipline of ascent, the way Massimo is looking at it and the way it's traditionally understood, which are practical spiritual exercises. And, Stoicism is a practical philosophy. It has a whole theoretical apparatus as well, and I don't want to downplay that, but it is a philosophy oriented towards living. And one of the cool things about the Stoics is that they did, in fact, give us a number of different really useful exercises, some of which overlap with other spiritual or intellectual or religious traditions. But these are particularly good. Massimo picks out 12 of these. I'm not going to try to provide a summary of them here. I'll just say that these are, pretty much classic ways of approaching things. I think it's a good number to work with. And so then he finishes with this appendix on the Hellenistic schools of practical philosophy, doing a little bit of comparative work. And I think he does a good job overall with this. So that's the style, the structure, and the summary of this How to Be a Stoic. All right, so with a book like this, I'm not going to try to sum up everything that I found positive about the book, because I think that would be quite long and might not be very helpful for the viewer. I'll just pick some things that I myself found particularly good, and then a few things that I think might help you make a decision about whether you want to get or read this book as somebody who's coming to it for the first time, or perhaps somebody who's read some about Stoicism but is looking for some engaging secondary literature. I will say this to start with. So this is definitely, as you say, it's not his first rodeo. This is definitely not Massimo's first bull that he's riding on. He's a well-established author, and I think that really shows not just in how well constructed the book is, but also in the way in which he frames things. You're almost always going to find a relatable example, sometimes taken from his own experience, sometimes from that of others. He's giving you, I think, for the general reader, the right amount of background and going to the right amount of depth, at least on nearly everything that he's talking about here. So, this is very well written, very well constructed. I think that, if I look at the Stoic components of this book, Massimo is not going to lead you astray on anything. And I actually, this is sort of a great test for me. When I read through something like this, do I, somebody who's been studying Stoicism for decades, get something out of it, and does it make me think a little bit more about things? And the answer is yes. So really nice work here. One of the other things that I do want to mention is that I like the fact that, he's, without sort of, just dumbing it down, he's bringing in a lot of other discussions that can lead somebody into reading other things. So, for example, when he's talking about Stoic conceptions of amathia or ignorance, or how we get things screwed up, he brings up Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, and he doesn't do the sort of typical hack job that a lot of people do with that, in part because he's trying to think about, well, what does this actually mean for us? So, I think it's a good discussion of that. Massimo is an old hand at, the evolution versus creationism stuff. That comes up in here to some extent, in an interesting way, too. He doesn't just talk about, listen, what does Darwin mean for living in accordance with nature? He also tells us something really cool. There's a great anecdote in here where he's talking about getting involved in these, debates and discussions, and being impressed by the fact that there were people on the other side who were, you might say, engaging him in good faith. And even though they disagreed with him, they wanted to, converse with him and have meals with him And he realized that the new atheists were, in some respects, kind of shooting themselves in the foot by being so militant and so uncompromising and dismissive of religious people. And Stoicism, would provide a different way of going about that. There's a lot of other people who he brings in. He talks about cognitive psychology and positive psychology, developmental psychology with Kohlberg and Piaget. I think that's kind of interesting. In the section on death, he brings up transhumanism and Ray Kurzweil's, notions. And so there's a lot of really good engagement of what you could call the contemporary intellectual culture being done here. I mentioned he does also talk about the new atheists and where he finds himself differing from them. So there's that. There's also some good discussion and bringing in contemporary Stoic figures like Bill Irvine, like Lawrence Becker, like Admiral James Stockdale. He also talks about his colleague Lou Marinoff and the philosophical counseling movement. So there's a lot of threads that a reader could follow out, and I think Massimo's book gives you enough meat that you would want to follow them out without overwhelming you with, going off on a tangent. As a matter of fact, you could say that one of the real strengths of this book is that while it does seem to be going off on tangents here and there, it's always coming back very quickly to the main points. So it's a quick trek through this book. Another thing that I think I really like about this book is that one of the things that Massimo does is sort of sets up where these contemporary dichotomies of thought typically lie. I mentioned the religion versus new atheism. He also talks about modern liberals and conservatives. And a number of other different dichotomous ways of dividing up the world. And he shows how Stoicism, and I think you can say this not just about Stoicism, but other forms of virtue ethics, is not going to fall on either of these sides, but kind of go in a different trajectory, which gives us a better understanding. So in a lot of these, hey, is it this or this? Either or, the Stoic is going to say, well, a bit of both. And then this, that's even better than those. And I think Massimo's doing a good job with that. I really love the idea of putting yourself in conversation with Epictetus. I think that that's an important aspect of studying any figure that we do want to place ourselves in kind of intellectual dialogue. I think this book demonstrates to us one way, I don't want to say the only way, but one way that can be done quite well. So I think that's a great model for the contemporary reader. And the last thing that I'll say about it is that I think he's really good at contextualizing Stoic ideas, not just within our larger society or the fabric of our lives, but also in relation to the development of Stoicism as a doctrine. So these are all a lot of what for me are sort of high points about this work. No work is ever perfect or without any flaw whatsoever. It would be kind of strange to expect that. And there are a few places where I found myself, not entirely happy with where the book was going. I understand that it's written for a popular audience, so these might seem something like a scholar's quibbles, and I will say that I do think that they're pretty minor, but I would like to signal them. I'll start by talking about the very end of the book, where we have the Hellenistic schools of practical philosophy, and I think that it's not technically correct to say that the Epicureans are somehow tracing themselves back to Socrates through the Cyrenaics. I understand why Massimo, who I think does know this quite well, would allow that to sort of slip into the book, because it makes things a little bit simpler, and it's not going to kill a reader, right, to find that out. But I mean, the Epicurean school was really a non-Socratic school. There's a little bit of controversy about this even in the ancient period, but most of the scholarship is on the side of definitely Epicurus and his followers are like, doing something different. They're coming from a different line. And so I that's one issue. The other thing that I'll say about that chapter is one thing that's totally missing in talking about the Hellenistic schools as being ways of life. There's no discussion of skepticism, whether that of Pyrrhonian skepticism, which definitely was a way of life, or the skepticism of the Academy with some of its key figures who were writing at the same time as the early Stoics and responding to them. So this, I think, is a little bit of a gap in here. One could quibble about the presentation of a few other things. But, that's that chapter. There are a few other little things here and there. Massimo says that Aristotle, in talking about the virtues, was obsessed with taxonomies, and he gives as his example of that the fact that he proposed a whopping 12 different types of virtue rather than the Stoics' simple 4, even though all types of virtue are really just different aspects of wisdom. I understand that's sort of a good talking point. It's not technically correct if you think that Aristotle was obsessed with taxonomies, just read some Stoic literature, and you'll find that the Stoics themselves engaged in all sorts of taxonomic discussions about things. So I don't think that's a peculiarly Aristotelian thing. As a matter of fact, the Platonists did that as well. I would say that's sort of endemic. And then, 12 types of virtue. If we're talking about the moral virtues, it's actually 11. There's the question of whether practical wisdom belongs in there, how it fits in there. And, there's a bit more structure to it, I think, in Aristotle's presentation than is being presented here. And the Stoics themselves, when they had those 4 kinds of virtue, they also broke them down into a whole bunch of sub-virtues as well. So let's not pretend that, there were just the 4 cardinal virtues and that made it super simple. So I think that's kind of important. I would say that, this book really is not designed to do this, but I would say that it's a little bit weird to me to see, discussing the virtues and the cardinal virtues and how they connect with, Stoicism and Christianity, to see all of the Christian thinkers up to Thomas Aquinas totally jumped over, so he says, what did the Christians do with the Socratic package of virtues? They took it on board wholesale and expanded it. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential Christian theologians of all time, developed the notion of heavenly virtues. I don't think so. Already there were plenty of other thinkers talking about faith, hope, and charity. There were a number of others that they would discuss as well, like humility and obedience. So this is a bit of a oversimplification. But again, I understand where he's going with that. The only other quibble I have that I'm not quite sure about is where, in discussing the argument from design, Massimo says that it's the first cogent attack on the argument from design came from David Hume. I'm not really sold about that. Cicero has this great dialogue on the nature of the gods, which I actually think that Hume's work is indebted to. And he has a skeptic in there arguing against the Epicurean and Stoic positions. The Stoics actually did rely on something like a design argument. And I think we can find other interesting attacks. Maybe what Massimo means is the first really devastating attack against the design argument comes from David Hume. If you say that, I think that could make sense. These are all fairly minor quibbles with it. On the whole, it's really a good book. All right, simply put, to bring this to a close, I think that if you don't already have this book, you probably do want to get it and read it. Even if you know quite a bit about Stoicism, it's a great read. You're going to rethink some things along the way. I really like the way that Massimo set this up. and how, Epictetus is, I'm a big fan of Epictetus, so if you make Epictetus your central figure, you're probably going to get my eye. But I think that's a really important thing to do. So I highly recommend this book. It's available now in a number of translations, a number of different versions, easy enough to get your hands on. I think this is going to be looking ahead to the future, understood as being, one of the central pieces of popular Stoic literature that does a really good job in staying true to the original text, but also in explaining things well for a contemporary audience of non-specialists, non-academics.